Winter has settled deeply over the northern landscape. Across the valley, the land lies still beneath a quiet layer of snow that has gathered slowly through the long evening hours. The hills that surround the settlement rise softly into the darkness, their shapes muted by frost and shadow. Above them, the winter sky stretches wide and black, the stars appearing sharper in the cold air, as if the night itself has grown clearer with the falling temperature. The snow does not fall now. Instead, it rests where it landed earlier, smoothing the ground and softening the rough lines of rock and earth. Even the frozen stream that curves through the valley moves silently beneath its thin skin of ice. The air carries almost no movement. Only now and then a faint breath of wind slides gently along the slopes, lifting a trace of loose snow and guiding it quietly across the surface before settling again into stillness. At the center of this quiet valley stands a cluster of wooden structures gathered close together. The Viking settlement rests low against the land, its long houses arranged along narrow paths that wind between them like pale threads across the snow. Their thick timber walls appear dark against the pale ground, and the sloping roofs are nearly hidden beneath the weight of winter. Most of the village has already withdrawn indoors, yet small signs of life remain visible in the night. From several rooftops, thin streams of smoke rise slowly through narrow openings where hearth fires burn within. The smoke drifts upward without hurry, fading gradually into the cold sky above the settlement. Here and there, a soft orange glow flickers briefly against the snow as firelight moves beneath the wooden roofs. The light appears only in passing, escaping through small gaps in the timber or along the edges of the roof vents before disappearing again into darkness. From a distance, the scattered lights resemble quiet embers resting across the village. The pathways between the homes lie almost untouched now. Snow has settled over the ground in smooth layers, covering the traces of footsteps left earlier in the day. Only the faint outline of the roots remains visible where the ground dips slightly between the buildings. The cold has deepened with the arrival of night. Breath rises slowly into the air before fading, and the stillness of the valley carries sound only reluctantly. Somewhere near the edge of the settlement, a wooden post shifts slightly as frost tightens its joints. The quiet creek travels briefly across the snow before disappearing again into silence. Otherwise, the village rests. Within the long houses, warmth gathers around the hearth fires that continue to burn at the center of each home. Thick timber walls and layers of turf hold that warmth carefully inside, shielding it from the deep cold that surrounds the settlement. Inside one of these longhouses, the fire glows steadily within a shallow hearth pit near the center of the floor. The flames have settled into a slower rhythm now, their light moving gently along the timber beams that rise toward the roof. Smoke travels upward through the vent above, leaving behind the steady warmth that fills the room. The air carries the quiet scent of wood smoke and wool. Along the walls, sleeping spaces have already been prepared for the night. Thick furs and woven blankets rest across raised wooden platforms, their surfaces catching the soft glow of the fire. Shadows move slowly across the timber walls as the hearth shifts and settles. Near the fire, a man sits quietly on one of the benches that face the warmth of the hearth. The heavy fur around his shoulders has been drawn close against the evening cold that lingered when he first came inside. For a moment he remains still, letting the warmth spread gradually through the layers of wool and hide that cover his arms. Outside, the winter air presses firmly against the longhouse walls, but inside the heat from the hearth continues its slow work, pushing the chill further back into the corners of the room. He reaches forward and adjusts one of the folded furs laid beside the hearth, preparing the space where he will rest later in the night. The movement is small and unhurried. Around him, the fire continues to glow with a steady warmth that has been carefully maintained since the evening meal ended. Embers shift quietly beneath the wood, releasing a soft crackle that rises briefly before fading again. Beyond the timber walls, the village remains quiet beneath the snow. Only the faint glow from scattered longhouses and the slow drift of smoke into the winter sky suggest the life continuing quietly within each home. Inside the longhouse, the man settles back slightly, the warmth of the hearth slowly working its way through the thick furs around him as the winter night deepens outside. For a time he remains seated near the hearth, letting the slow warmth settle through the heavy layers wrapped around his shoulders. The fire has burned steadily through the evening, and now it glows with the quieter rhythm that follows the night meal. Flames move low among the stacked pieces of wood, leaning occasionally as the air shifts through the roof vent above. Beneath them, red embers spread outward across the ash bed, breathing faint heat into the room. He holds his hands toward the fire without stretching too close. The warmth travels slowly through the thick wool of his sleeves. It does not rush. Winter warmth rarely does. Instead, it gathers little by little, pushing back the deeper cold that lingers in joints and fingertips after time spent outdoors. The longhouse itself breathes with the fire. Timber beams darkened by smoke run along the roof above, their surfaces catching the shifting orange glow from the hearth below. Shadows drift quietly across the planks, moving whenever the flames shift or settle deeper among the wood. Along the walls, the raised sleeping platforms remain quiet. Furs lie folded across them, their thick surfaces holding the memory of warmth from the evening fire. Some have already been spread out where others in the household have begun to rest. Beyond the walls of timber and turf, the winter night presses steadily against the house. The cold outside is patient. It leans slowly against the outer walls, testing every seam in the wood and earth. But the long house has stood through many winters. The heavy turf packed along its sides holds the cold at a distance, while the hearth continues its quiet work within. The man shifts slightly on the bench and turns his head toward the doorway. The door itself is closed now, the thick plank secured against the wind. Only a narrow seam of darkness shows where the wood meets the frame. No snow drifts through tonight. The air outside remains still enough that the entrance holds firm. For a moment he listens. The fire speaks softly beside him. A thin crack travels through one of the burning logs before settling again into quiet embers. Somewhere along the wall, A wooden beam adjusts slightly as frost tightens the outer structure. These sounds are familiar. They belong to the night as much as the firelight itself. He reaches down beside the bench and lifts a folded fur that had been resting near the hearthstones. The hide is thick and heavy in his hands, its surface rough where the leather shows through and softer where the winter fur remains. He gives it a small shake before laying it across the sleeping platform closest to the fire. The motion stirs a faint swirl of warm air rising from the hearth. It carries the scent of wood smoke and animal hide through the room before fading again. Outside the long house, the settlement remains quiet beneath the snow. The paths between the homes lie pale under the faint light of the sky. From several rooftops, thin smoke continues to rise, drifting slowly upward before dissolving into the darkness above. Inside the long house, the warmth remains steady. He presses the fur flat with both hands, smoothing its surface across the wooden boards of the sleeping space. The platform itself holds a trace of heat from the fire that has burned nearby throughout the evening. It is not strong warmth, but it is enough. When the night grows long, even a small measure of heat held within wood or wool becomes valuable. He pauses again near the edge of the platform, listening to the quiet of the room. Across the longhouse, others have already settled into their sleeping places. Shapes beneath blankets remain still except for the slow rise and fall of breath. No one speaks now. The fire provides enough sound to fill the silence. A small piece of wood shifts within the hearth and falls slightly deeper into the embers. Sparks move briefly across the ash before disappearing beneath the glowing coals. The man watches the movement for a moment. Fires change slowly at night. During the day, flames may burn bright and restless, fed often with fresh wood as meals are prepared and work continues within the home. But after dark, the fire is allowed to quiet itself. Wood is placed more carefully. The goal is not strong flame but lasting heat. He leans forward slightly and adjusts one of the logs that rests along the outer edge of the hearth. The wood settles deeper into the embers with a soft shift of ash. Orange light brightens briefly along the edges before dimming again into the steady glow of coals. He does not add more wood. The fire must last through many hours yet, and too much flame now would consume the fuel too quickly. Instead, the embers are allowed to hold their strength slowly, feeding warmth into the room long after the flames themselves have lowered. Outside, the cold deepens as the night continues. Snow along the rooftops grows harder as frost tightens across its surface. The valley beyond the settlement remains dark and still beneath the winter sky. But inside the long house, the fire continues its quiet work. The man draws the fur closer along the edge of the sleeping platform, adjusting it so the thickest portion lies nearest the hearth. Heat travels unevenly through the room, strongest near the fire and fading slowly toward the outer walls. He knows this pattern well. Each winter night follows it. The places closest to the hearth remain warm longest. Those farther away rely more heavily on thick wool and layered hides. He straightens slightly and turns his attention toward the roof vent above the fire. A faint ribbon of smoke continues to drift upward through the opening, carried by the slow movement of warm air rising from the hearth. The smoke does not rush to night. It slips quietly into the night sky beyond the roof. This slow movement tells him something about the air outside. When wind moves strongly across the settlement, smoke may shift or circle before leaving the roof opening, but tonight it rises clean and straight. The valley rests in stillness. He lowers his gaze again toward the hearth. The embers glow steadily beneath the wood, their light spreading softly across the floor of packed earth. Each piece of fuel settles gradually as the fire consumes it, releasing warmth into the surrounding air. For the moment, the fire holds well. The longhouse remains quiet, and beyond its walls, the Viking village rests beneath the deep winter night. After a while, he rises from the bench beside the hearth. The movement is slow, more a quiet shift of balance than a sudden action. The warmth that had gathered around him near the fire fades slightly as he steps away, replaced by the cooler air that lingers farther from the hearth's reach. He pulls the fur a little tighter around his shoulders before crossing the floor. The packed earth beneath his boots is firm and cold, though the heat from the fire has softened the chill near the center of the room. Closer to the outer walls, the temperature changes again. There the cold presses gently through the timber and turf, reminding the house that winter waits just beyond it. He moves toward the doorway. The door itself remains closed, its thick plank surface darkened by years of smoke and weather. Iron fittings hold it firmly against the frame, and the wooden bar that secures it rests in its place across the inner supports. He does not open it. Instead, he places one hand briefly against the timber beside the door. The wood feels colder than the air near the fire. The longhouse walls hold warmth well, but winter is patient. Through the hours of night, the cold slowly tests every surface that separates the inside from the frozen air beyond. He lowers his hand and stands still for a moment. Outside, the settlement remains quiet beneath the snow. From within the longhouse, the village cannot be seen clearly. Only a faint darkness gathers along the narrow seam at the bottom of the doorway, where a thin trace of night presses through. But the man knows the shapes waiting beyond, the narrow paths that wind between the homes, the low wooden fences that hold animals in their enclosures, the long houses themselves, their roofs buried beneath the pale weight of winter. Earlier in the evening, those paths carried the final movements of the day. Neighbors returning to their homes after visiting nearby families. A few last bundles of firewood carried indoors before the cold deepened. The brief sounds of voices drifting through the twilight air. Now those sounds have faded. The village settles early during the deepest part of winter. Darkness arrives long before morning work will begin again, and the cold encourages everyone to remain close to their fires. He turns slightly and looks back toward the center of the longhouse. The hearth remains the brightest place in the room. Its glow spreads outward across the beams above and the sleeping platforms along the walls. Shadows rise and fall slowly as the embers shift beneath the wood. One of the sleepers near the far wall stirs beneath a heavy blanket, adjusting position before becoming still again. The room soon returns to quiet breathing and the steady pulse of the fire. He walks a few steps toward the storage bench along the side of the house. A small pile of wood rests there, gathered earlier in the day and brought inside before nightfall. Each piece has already been cut and split, the pale surfaces of fresh wood visible where the axe passed through the grain. He lifts one of the pieces and turns it in his hands. The wood is dry and light. It will burn quickly if placed directly among the flames. But for now, the fire does not require more fuel. The embers remain strong enough to carry heat through the coming hours. He returns the wood to the pile. For a moment he remains standing there, listening again to the sounds that travel through the quiet longhouse. The fire breathes slowly. Somewhere above, the smoke continues to slip through the roof opening into the still night air. The faint draft that feeds the hearth moves gently through the room, barely stirring the hanging shadows along the beams. Beyond the walls, the settlement lies under its covering of snow. Across the village, other fires burn much like this one. In each long house, embers glow beneath carefully placed wood while families settle into the long hours of winter darkness. From outside, the settlement would appear almost motionless. Only the thin smoke rising from several rooftops would suggest the warmth held within the homes. The paths between buildings would appear smooth and pale under the faint sky, their earlier footprints already fading beneath frost. Within animal enclosures near the edges of the settlement, a few shapes shift quietly in their stroll. The animals move slowly in winter nights, conserving their warmth just as the people do. Occasionally one of them will step or turn, sending a brief rustle through the still air before settling again. But most of the village remains quiet. Inside the longhouse, the man returns toward the hearth. The warmth grows stronger again as he approaches the center of the room. The glow of the embers reflects faintly along the metal fittings of a nearby cooking pot that hangs beside the fire. He kneels briefly near the hearthstones and studies the pattern of coals. Red light pulses softly through the ash. Beneath the surface, heat spreads outward in slow waves. A few thin tongues of flame still rise where the wood rests against the embers, but they burn quietly and without urgency. He takes a small branch from the pile beside the hearth and places it gently along the edge of the coals. The branch catches slowly. Its bark darkens first, then curls slightly as heat moves through it. After a moment, a thin line of flame appears along its surface, feeding the embers without disturbing their steady glow. He watches for a moment to be sure the fire remains balanced. Too much flame would brighten the room and consume the wood too quickly. Too little would allow the embers to weaken before morning. Tonight the fire holds its strength easily. He stands again and steps back from the hearth. The warmth now reaches him once more, spreading through the thick layers of wool and fur around his shoulders. His breath moves slowly in the air of the room, though the cold that lingers near the outer walls never fully disappears. winter rarely allows that. He glances once more toward the doorway. Beyond it, the village rests beneath the quiet sky. Soon he will step outside for a short walk through the settlement paths, as he often does before the deepest part of night settles over the valley. The cold air outside will feel sharper after the warmth of the hearth, and the silence of the snow-covered village will carry a different kind of stillness than the quiet within the longhouse. For now, though, the fire continues its slow, steady glow behind him as he prepares to step into the winter night. He lifts the wooden bar from its place across the door. The movement is quiet but solid, the weight of the timber shifting in his hands as he eases it free from the brackets along the wall. For a moment he holds it there, listening again to the calm breathing of the longhouse behind him and the steady glow of the fire. Then he pulls the door inward. The cold enters first. It does not rush violently into the room, but it arrives with a firm clarity that belongs only to winter nights. The air outside feels sharper than the air near the hearth, carrying the clean scent of snow and the faint dryness of frost. He steps through the doorway and pulls the door closed behind him. The difference is immediate. The warmth of the fire remains within the longhouse walls, and here outside the cold stands openly beneath the dark sky. His breath appears slowly before his face, drifting upward in pale clouds before dissolving into the night. For a moment he stands just beyond the doorway, allowing his eyes to adjust to the darkness. The snow across the settlement reflects a faint light from the sky above. Even without a moon, the ground appears pale enough to shape the paths between the homes. The long houses stand quietly along those paths, their low roofs rising gently above the drifts of snow that have gathered against their walls. Smoke moves slowly upward from several rooftops. It rises through narrow openings where the hearth fires burn inside each home, forming thin trails that drift into the still night air before fading against the dark sky. The village does not sleep entirely, but most of its life now remains behind the timber walls of the long houses. He begins walking along the path. Snow presses softly beneath his boots, the surface firm where frost has tightened it during the evening. Earlier footprints remain faintly visible where others passed through before night settled fully across the settlement. Some of those tracks lead toward nearby homes. Others follow the narrow routes between buildings where neighbors visited during the last hours of daylight. But as the cold deepened and darkness filled the valley, most of those movements slowly came to an end. Now the paths remain mostly undisturbed. He moves slowly between the long houses, the shapes of the buildings rising quietly on either side of him. Their timber walls appear dark against the snow, while the roofs hold thick layers of frost that soften the edges of their beams. From one nearby roof, a stronger glow flickers briefly along the snow. The light escapes through the smoke opening above the hearth, where the fire inside must still burn with steady strength. The glow shifts gently as the flames move within the house, then fades again as the smoke thickens above it. He pauses along the path and looks across the settlement. From here, The pattern of firelight becomes easier to see. Not every longhouse shows the same glow. Some fires burn lower now, leaving only faint light rising through the vents above the roofs. Others still carry small flames that brighten the snow for a moment before settling again into embers. Together, these scattered lights give the village a quiet rhythm. They appear and fade gently across the rooftops like distant coals resting beneath the winter sky. The man watches the movement for a moment. It tells him something about the life within the homes around him. Some families remain awake longer beside their fires. Others have already settled into sleep while their embers continue to hold the warmth of the evening. Above the village, the sky remains wide and dark. Stars shine clearly in the cold air, their light steady against the deep stillness of the valley. The surrounding hills form a quiet boundary around the settlement, their snow-covered slopes blending softly into the darkness. He resumes walking. The path curves slightly between two long houses before opening toward a wider space near the center of the settlement. Here the snow lies smoother across the ground, broken only by a few tracks left earlier in the evening. A low wooden fence runs along one edge of the open space. Beyond it, the animal enclosure rests beneath the snow. The fence posts rise from the ground like dark markers against the pale surface, while inside the enclosure shapes of straw and shelter sit quietly beneath the frost. One of the animals shifts within the enclosure. The sound is faint but clear in the still air, a soft movement of hoofs pressing into straw followed by the quiet rustle of dry bedding. For a moment the shape moves along the edge of the shelter, then settles again. The man continues along the path without hurry. The cold air moves across his face now, sharper than it felt near the doorway of the longhouse. Yet the fur around his shoulders holds much of the warmth he carried from the hearth, allowing the cold to settle only gradually. This brief walk through the settlement is not unusual. Many in the village step outside once more before the deepest hours of night arrive. The stillness of winter evenings invites these quiet moments, a chance to observe the settlement beneath the sky and to listen to the small sounds that remain after most fires have been tended and doors have closed. He reaches a point where the path rises slightly along a low ridge of packed snow. From there, the entire cluster of long houses spreads out before him. Their roofs lie heavy beneath the winter frost, the shapes of their beams softened by snow. Smoke continues to rise from several homes, drifting upward without resistance into the calm air above. Between the houses, the narrow paths wind gently through the settlement, their pale surfaces faintly visible beneath the sky. No voices carry through the night now, only the quiet creak of timber now and then, or the soft shifting of animals within their enclosures. The village breathes slowly in winter darkness. He stands there for a while, observing the scattered glow of hearth fires across the settlement, each one burning quietly behind the timber walls where families rest against the long hours of cold outside. Above the rooftops, the thin smoke continues its slow rise into the night. From the small rise of packed snow where he stands, The edge of the settlement lies only a short distance ahead. The long houses cluster closely together near the center of the village, their walls forming a quiet boundary against the open land beyond. But farther out, the buildings grow fewer, leaving wider spaces where the snow gathers untouched between the paths. He steps down from the ridge and continues walking. The snow beneath his boots grows smoother here. Fewer people pass this way after nightfall, and the frost has begun to harden the surface where the last light of evening once softened it. The longhouse roofs remain visible behind him, their slopes rounded beneath thick layers of snow. Smoke still rises from several vents, though the trails have grown thinner as the fires inside settle into slower embers. Ahead, the village boundary appears. It is not marked by walls or gates. Instead, the settlement simply loosens its hold on the land. The cluster of homes ends, and beyond them the open ground stretches toward the darker slopes of the valley. He slows his pace. At the final row of long houses, the path widens slightly, spreading into a patch of snow that has been brushed by earlier footsteps but never fully cleared. A few fence posts stand nearby, marking the outer edge of one of the animal enclosures. Beyond them, the ground falls away into the quiet valley. The cold feels stronger here. Without the shelter of the surrounding buildings, the night air moves more freely across the snow. It is not a strong wind, but a faint current passes along the valley floor, brushing lightly against the exposed ground before drifting away again. The man stops near the final fence post. He rests one hand briefly on the top of the wood. The post is cold and firm beneath his palm, the grain of the timber rough where frost has settled along its surface. From this point he can see beyond the village more clearly. The valley lies silent beneath its cover of snow. Low ridges curve along the distant edges of the land, their slopes dark against the pale ground where the frost has gathered in shallow drifts. The frozen stream that winds through the valley reflects faint traces of the sky above. Its narrow line curves gently through the snow before disappearing behind the lower hills. Nothing moves along its surface tonight. The cold has settled deeply across the land, and even the animals that wander the valley during daylight now remain hidden in the shelter of trees and rocks along the slopes. Behind him, the village continues its quiet presence. From here, the long houses appear lower against the snow, their roofs blending softly into the pale ground around them. The glow of their hearth fires is less visible from this distance, but the thin smoke drifting upward from the vents still marks their place within the dark valley. He turns slightly, looking back across the settlement. Several roofs release slow trails of smoke into the sky, the lines rising straight upward through the calm air before thinning into nothing. When the night wind grows stronger, those trails often bend or scatter as they leave the rooftops. Tonight they climb steadily. The stillness of the air allows them to rise without interruption. This quiet balance between fire and cold is familiar during winter nights. Inside each longhouse, families remain gathered around their hearths. Embers glow beneath wood carefully placed to last through the hours before dawn. Furs and blankets hold warmth close, as the outside air presses steadily against the walls. Yet beyond those walls, the cold waits without urgency. It stretches across the valley, resting over the snow-covered ground and along the slopes of the surrounding hills. The night belongs to it now, filling the spaces between homes and fences where the warmth of the hearth cannot reach. The man listens to the silence. Even the small sounds of the settlement feel distant from here. A faint creak of timber drifts briefly through the air before fading again. Somewhere behind the long houses, an animal shifts in its shelter, rustling straw against wooden boards. Then the quiet returns. He remains near the fence post for a moment longer. The fur around his shoulders holds the warmth he carried from the long house, but the cold air continues its slow work. It gathers along the edges of his sleeves and across the uncovered parts of his face. Winter cold never arrives all at once. It moves gradually, settling layer by layer until the body begins to feel its steady presence. He lowers his hand from the fence post and looks once more across the valley. The snow reflects the faint light of the sky, giving the land a pale stillness that stretches outward into the dark slopes beyond. The frozen stream remains silent where it curves through the valley floor. Above it all, the stars hold their quiet places across the sky. They shine clearly in the cold air, steady and distant. Behind him, the Viking village continues to rest beneath its roofs of snow. Smoke rises slowly from the hearth vents. Warmth gathers inside the longhouses, and the narrow paths between the homes lie quiet beneath the frost. After a moment, he turns away from the valley and begins walking back toward the cluster of buildings at the center of the settlement. He leaves the edge of the settlement behind and follows the path back toward the long houses. The snow beneath his boots holds the faint marks of his earlier steps, though the frost has already begun to soften their edges. Winter nights slowly erase the traces of movement that passed through the village during the day. By morning, many of these tracks will appear shallower, their shapes pressed smooth again beneath the cold. The cluster of homes grows closer as he walks. From the valley boundary, the long houses seemed low and quiet against the snow, but now their shapes rise more clearly in the dim light of the sky. Their timber walls form dark lines across the pale ground, and the heavy roofs slope downward beneath the weight of frost and packed snow. Smoke continues to rise from several vents. Each trail moves upward slowly, spreading thin as it meets the cold air above the rooftops. The smoke carries the faint scent of burning wood, a dry and familiar smell that lingers gently across the settlement on calm nights like this one. He moves between two long houses where the path narrows again. Here the buildings stand close enough to shelter the ground between them. The snow is slightly less hardened in this space, protected from the open air of the valley. His boots press a little deeper into the surface with each step. Along the outer wall of one long house, a row of stacked firewood rests beneath a low wooden cover. The logs were cut earlier in the season and brought close to the homes so that fuel could be gathered easily during winter storms. Their ends show pale where the axes split them, and the outer surfaces carry a light coating of frost. Even now, in the quiet of night, that wood waits for the slow work of the hearth fires within the homes. He passes the stack without stopping. Ahead, the path curves gently around the side of another longhouse, where a narrow strip of ground remains visible beneath the snow. The warmth escaping faintly through the walls has softened the frost along this edge, leaving the snow thinner there than in the open spaces beyond. The glow of a hearth becomes visible above the roofline. It flickers briefly through the smoke opening, lighting the drifting smoke from below before fading again. The movement of the flames inside is invisible from here, yet their presence can be felt in the rhythm of that changing light. Inside the house, someone has likely added a fresh piece of wood to the fire. The flames would rise for a time, brightening the interior of the long house before settling once more into steady embers. He slows slightly as he passes the doorway. The door remains closed, its thick planks resting quietly against the frame. No light escapes through the seams tonight. The warmth of the hearth remains sealed inside. Yet from within the walls a faint sound carries outward. It is not loud, only the quiet shifting of timber as the house settles deeper into the cold. When the temperature drops during winter nights, the beams and boards adjust slowly against one another. The wood tightens along its joints, releasing brief creaks that travel through the still air before disappearing again. These sounds are common in winter settlements. They belong to the longhouses as much as the fires within them. He continues along the path. The center of the village approaches once more, where several narrow routes cross between the homes. Here the snow has been disturbed more often during the day, leaving shallow depressions where feet passed earlier. A low post stands near the crossing, marking the boundary of another enclosure where animals remain sheltered. Inside the enclosure, the shapes of straw shelters rise above the snow. Most of the animals have settled for the night, but one of them moves slightly near the edge of the shelter. The faint scrape of hooves against packed ground carries through the quiet air. The sound fades quickly. Animals rest deeply during cold nights, conserving their strength until the morning light returns. He pauses briefly near the post, resting one hand against its rough surface. From this point, the village spreads outward again around him. Long houses stand in quiet rows along the winding paths, their snow covered roofs blending softly into the pale ground. Thin smoke continues to drift from the vents above them, rising in calm lines toward the dark sky. The fires inside these homes burn slowly now. Earlier in the evening, they would have carried stronger flames while meals were prepared and people moved about the rooms. But as the night deepened, the wood was placed more carefully, allowing the embers to hold their strength without consuming the fuel too quickly. This quiet balance is important during the longest nights of winter. The fire must last until morning. He lifts his hand from the post and resumes walking. The air between the buildings feels slightly warmer than the open ground beyond the settlement. The walls of the long houses break the faint movement of wind that travels through the valley, allowing the cold to settle more gently here. Even so, the frost continues to gather along the surfaces of wood and snow. The path carries him gradually back toward the longhouse where his own hearth waits inside. From here, the faint glow of its fire is not yet visible above the roofline, but he knows its place among the others, just beyond the next bend in the path. Behind him, the edge of the settlement fades again into darkness, where the valley lies still beneath its wide covering of snow. Ahead, the quiet village continues to breathe slowly beneath the winter sky. He walks a little farther along the path before slowing again. Here the buildings stand in a closer cluster, their walls forming narrow passages where the snow gathers in uneven drifts. The ground beneath his boots changes with each step, firm in some places where many people passed earlier in the day, softer in others, where the snow has settled undisturbed against the edges of the homes. He pauses near the corner of a long house. The timber wall beside him rises dark and quiet, its surface rough beneath a thin layer of frost. Along the upper edge of the roof, a line of snow rests heavily against the beams, held there by the slow freeze of the evening cold. Above that roof, smoke continues its steady rise. It leaves the narrow opening at the top of the long house and moves upward without bending, thinning slowly as it meets the colder air of the night sky. He watches the smoke for a moment. The stillness of the air allows the trail to remain almost perfectly straight as it climbs. If wind were moving across the settlement, the smoke would drift sideways or curl briefly above the roof before fading into the dark. But tonight the valley holds its breath. The quiet of winter spreads across the settlement, carrying even the smallest sounds farther than they would travel during the busy hours of the day. Somewhere beyond the row of long houses, a faint wooden creak moves through the air. It is a small sound, the shifting of a beam or the tightening of a plank as frost settles deeper into the structure of a house. The noise travels slowly across the snow-covered ground before disappearing again into the silence. He remains still, listening. From another direction, a softer sound follows. A rustling movement from within one of the nearby enclosures reaches him, the brief stir of straw beneath the weight of an animal shifting in its shelter. The movement lasts only a moment before quiet returns. These sounds do not disturb the stillness of the village. They belong to it. During winter nights, the settlement rarely becomes completely silent. Even when most people sleep and the fires burn low, the buildings themselves continue their quiet adjustments against the cold. The timber walls breathe slowly. As the temperature drops through the night, the wood contracts slightly along its joints. Small spaces tighten, beams press more firmly against their supports, and the house answers with faint creaks that echo softly across the settlement. He continues walking. The path bends gently around another long house, bringing him into a slightly wider space where several routes meet. Here the snow carries more signs of the day's movement. Footprints cross the ground in overlapping patterns, their shapes already fading beneath the frost that settles into the surface. At the center of the crossing stands a low wooden trough, half buried in snow. During warmer months, animals are often brought here to drink from water carried through the village. Now the trough rests unused beneath a thin layer of ice that has formed across its surface. He stops beside it briefly. The ice reflects a faint patch of starlight from the sky above, forming a pale shimmer within the hollowed wood. The air feels colder here than it did between the closer buildings. Without the shelter of walls on every side, the faint movement of night air passes more freely across the open space. It brushes lightly against the snow before slipping away again into the narrow paths that lead deeper into the settlement. He adjusts the fur along his shoulders. The warmth he carried from the longhouse earlier still lingers beneath the thick layers of wool and hide, but the cold has begun its slow return along the edges of his sleeves and collar. Winter nights require patience. Warmth fades gradually when one steps away from the hearth, just as cold settles slowly when standing outside beneath the open sky. He leaves the trough behind and follows the path that leads toward his own longhouse. As he walks, the familiar shapes of the surrounding homes pass quietly on either side. Some show faint glows above their rooftops where embers still burn strongly within. Others reveal only thin smoke rising into the night, the fire inside having settled deeper into its bed of coals. In each of those homes, warmth gathers around the hearth. Families rest beneath furs and blankets while the fires continue their quiet work. The embers release heat slowly through the long hours before dawn, warming the timber walls and the sleeping platforms where people lie close together against the cold. Outside, the village continues its calm watch beneath the winter sky. The paths remain empty, smoke drifts steadily upward, and the long houses hold their quiet warmth within thick walls of timber and turf. Ahead, he can now see the faint outline of his own roof rising above the snow, waiting where the path curves gently back toward the place where his hearth burns inside. The path narrows again as he approaches the row of long houses where his own home stands. Snow rests thicker here along the edges of the buildings, pressed into shallow ridges where wind earlier in the day drifted it against the walls. The roofs above him slope low and heavy beneath their coverings of frost, their beams dark against the pale ground. He moves slowly along the familiar route. Each step carries him closer to the doorway he left not long before. Though the settlement remains quiet around him, the subtle changes between one part of the village and another are easy to notice during the still hours of night. Here the air feels slightly calmer. The nearby buildings form a loose shelter against the valley's open cold. Even the faint movement of air that passed along the settlement boundary seems to weaken between these walls of timber and turf. The path curves gently between two long houses. As he passes, the soft glow from one hearth appears briefly along the snow near the roof vent. The light flickers for a moment as the flames inside shift against the wood, then fades again into darkness as the smoke thickens above it. He slows his pace. The quiet rhythm of these scattered fires spreads across the village like distant breathing. Some hearths still carry small flames, while others have settled almost entirely into embers. From time to time, a faint crack of burning wood escapes through the roof openings, though the sound rarely travels far beyond the walls that hold the warmth within. He continues walking. Ahead, the outline of his own longhouse becomes clearer. The roof lies heavy beneath its covering of snow, the thick turf along its sides blending with the frozen ground around it. From the narrow smoke opening above the hearth, a thin line of smoke rises steadily into the cold air. The trail moves slowly upward before fading against the dark sky. He pauses briefly along the path, watching the smoke drift. Inside the house, the fire he left behind continues to burn among its bed of embers. The warmth gathered there will still be waiting when he returns, held quietly within the timber walls. This slow balance between the fire and the night air shapes every winter evening in the settlement. Outside, the cold presses steadily against the homes. Inside, warmth spreads from the hearth and settles across the sleeping spaces where people rest beneath their blankets of wool and fur. He walks the final stretch of path toward the doorway. The snow beneath his boots is firmer here where he stepped earlier. The faint marks of his tracks remain visible in the pale surface, though the frost has begun smoothing their edges. Above the doorway, the roof beam carries a thin crust of ice that formed earlier in the evening when warmer air from inside the house touched the colder wood outside. The ice glimmers faintly in the starlight. He reaches the doorway and rests his hand briefly against the wood beside it. The timber feels colder than it did before he left. During the time he spent walking through the settlement, the longhouse walls have continued their quiet exchange with the winter air. The warmth inside pushes outward through the turf and wood, while the cold slowly presses back from outside. Yet the balance still holds. Within the house, the hearth remains strong enough to keep the interior from surrendering to the deeper cold of the valley night. He stands there for a moment, listening. Behind the door, the fire continues its steady work. Though the sound is faint through the wood, the quiet crackle of embers shifting against one another reaches him. The settlement around him remains calm. No voices carry through the night. Only the occasional creak of timber from another longhouse drifts briefly through the air before fading again into stillness. Above the rooftops, the stars remain bright and unmoving. Smoke from the surrounding hearths rises gently toward them, thin lines of gray dissolving into the dark sky. He lowers his hand from the wall and steps closer to the doorway. The fur around his shoulders holds a trace of the warmth he carried from the house earlier, though the cold air has slowly worked its way through the outer layers. Soon the heat of the hearth will reach him again. He lifts the wooden latch and begins to open the door, allowing the quiet glow of the fire inside to meet the cold winter night outside. Before stepping fully inside, he pauses in the doorway. The door has opened only part way, leaving a narrow space between the warmth of the longhouse and the cold that rests across the village outside. Through that opening, The glow of the hearth reaches outward in a soft band of orange light, touching the snow just beyond the threshold. For a moment he remains where he is. Behind him, the settlement stretches quietly beneath the winter sky. From this position at the doorway, the village appears calm and distant at the same time. The long houses sit low across the snow covered ground, their roofs rounded by frost and their walls dark against the pale surface of the paths. Thin smoke continues to rise from several of the roof openings. Each trail moves slowly upward, fading into the cold air above the settlement before it can spread far across the sky. The stillness of the night allows the smoke to climb without disturbance. A few faint glows appear among the rooftops, where fires inside the home still carry small flames. Those lights do not shine steadily. Instead, they brighten and soften in slow rhythm as the wood within the hearths settles deeper into embers. He watches those distant flickers for a moment. They are small signs of the life that continues inside the homes scattered across the village. Behind each roof lies a hearth similar to the one burning inside the long house behind him, embers holding their warmth beneath carefully placed wood while families rest nearby. The quiet of winter night surrounds them all. The snow along the village paths reflects a faint light from the sky above. Though the moon has not yet risen, the pale ground gathers enough brightness to reveal the winding routes between the buildings. Earlier footprints lie faint across those paths. Some lead toward nearby homes where neighbors visited before the darkness deepened. Others cross the central spaces of the settlement, where people moved between tasks during the final hours of daylight. Now those tracks remain undisturbed. The frost has begun smoothing their edges, slowly returning the snow to its unbroken surface. From somewhere near the outer enclosures, a soft rustling sound travels briefly through the air. One of the animals has shifted again in its shelter, disturbing the straw beneath its hooves before settling once more into stillness. The sound fades quickly across the quiet ground. He draws the fur closer around his shoulders. The warmth of the longhouse now touches his back through the open doorway, spreading slowly through the heavy layers of wool and hide. In contrast, the cold air of the settlement presses lightly against the exposed parts of his face. This brief meeting of warmth and winter air creates a narrow space where both can be felt at once. It is a familiar moment during nights like this. Inside, the fire continues its steady glow. Outside, the cold holds its quiet place across the village. He glances once more across the settlement. From this doorway, the cluster of long houses appears almost motionless beneath the winter sky. The scattered smoke trails rise calmly from their vents, and the faint glows of hearth fires appear now and then among the rooftops. Beyond the village boundary, the valley lies dark and still. The frozen stream winds unseen through the snow beyond the homes, and the slopes of the surrounding hills blend softly into the darkness. Above them, all the stars remain bright and steady. For a moment longer, he watches the quiet scene. Then he turns back toward the warmth of the longhouse. The firelight grows stronger as he steps inside, the glow spreading across the packed earth floor and the timber beams above. The cold air that followed him through the doorway lingers briefly near the entrance before the warmth of the hearth begins to soften it. He pulls the door closed behind him. The wooden latch settles into place with a quiet sound. Immediately, the longhouse gathers its warmth again. The fire burns low but steady at the center of the room, its embers glowing beneath the carefully arranged wood. The light moves gently across the sleeping platforms where the furs lie waiting, and the air inside carries the familiar scent of smoke and wool. For a moment he stands near the door, letting the warmth return gradually through the layers of clothing that shielded him from the cold outside. The quiet rhythm of the hearth fills the room once more. The warmth settles around him slowly. At first, it touches only the outer layers of the furs across his shoulders, but as he stands near the doorway, the heat from the hearth begins to travel deeper through the wool and hide. The cold that followed him inside lingers briefly along the floor near the entrance before fading into the warmer air that gathers toward the center of the room. He moves away from the door. Each step carries him closer to the hearth, where the light glows steadily across the packed earth. The embers have shifted slightly since he last tended them. A narrow line of flame moves along the edge of one of the logs, feeding gently on the wood before settling again into the deeper glow beneath it. He kneels beside the hearthstones. The heat here is stronger, rising in slow waves that warm the air near the floor and spread outward toward the sleeping platforms along the walls. Ash rests lightly across the surface of the embers, its pale gray layer broken by small openings where the red light shines through. He reaches forward and studies the fire. The wood he placed earlier has begun to settle deeper into the coals. Its bark has darkened and curled away in places where the heat has worked through the surface. Beneath it, the embers remain bright, holding their strength well. For a moment he remains still, watching the slow movement of the fire. The flames are smaller now than they were earlier in the evening. That is expected during this part of the night. A strong blaze would consume the wood too quickly, leaving little warmth for the long hours before dawn. Instead, the fire is allowed to breathe quietly. He lifts one of the smaller pieces of wood from the pile beside the hearth. The branch is dry and light in his hand, its surface rough where it was split earlier in the season. He places it gently along the outer edge of the embers, where the heat is steady but not yet intense. The wood rests there for a moment before beginning to darken. Thin wisps of smoke curl from its surface as the warmth spreads through the grain. Soon a faint line of flame appears along its edge, feeding the coals without disturbing their balance. He adjusts one of the larger logs slightly with the tip of a small stick. The wood shifts deeper into the embers, sending a quiet shower of sparks across the ash bed. The sparks fade quickly, leaving the fire once again settled into its steady glow. Satisfied, he sets the stick aside. The warmth of the hearth now spreads more evenly through the center of the longhouse. The air near the floor grows softer as the embers release their heat into the room. He rises slowly. Across the house, the sleeping platforms remain quiet beneath their layers of fur and wool. The shapes beneath the blankets have not moved much since he stepped outside earlier. The longhouse breathes with the slow rhythm of rest. Only the fire continues its gentle work. He walks toward the sleeping space closest to the hearth where he prepared the furs earlier. The thick hide still lies spread across the wooden platform, its surface warmed slightly by the nearby embers. He presses one hand against it. The wood beneath the fur holds a faint trace of heat from the fire. It is not strong, but it is enough to soften the cold that gathers along the outer edges of the room. He sits down along the edge of the platform. The warmth from the hearth reaches his back while the cooler air near the walls rests lightly along his shoulders. Between these two currents, the longhouse finds its balance, warmth near the center, cold held at a distance by timber and turf. He loosens the fur from around his shoulders and folds it beside the sleeping space. The heavy hide falls softly against the platform, its thick surface ready to hold the warmth of the body once he lies down. Nearby, the fire continues to glow steadily, its embers shifting only slightly as the wood settles deeper into the coals. For a moment, he sits quietly. Beyond the walls of the longhouse, the winter night continues across the settlement. The longhouses remain still beneath their coverings of snow, and the thin trails of smoke rise gently into the dark sky above the village. Inside, the hearth keeps its patient watch. The glow of the embers moves slowly across the timber beams overhead, and the quiet crackle of burning wood spreads through the calm air of the room. Gradually, the warmth of the fire reaches him again, easing the last traces of cold left from the walk through the village paths. He leans back slightly on the edge of the sleeping platform. The warmth of the hearth reaches him from across the short distance of the floor, rising in slow waves that soften the air of the room. It does not feel as strong as it did earlier in the evening, yet the steady glow of the embers continues to hold the cold away from the center of the longhouse. For a moment, he simply listens. The fire produces the quiet sounds that belong to late winter nights, the soft settling of ash, the occasional shift of wood as the embers work slowly through its grain. These sounds rise and fade without hurry, leaving long pauses of stillness between them. Across the room, the sleeping platforms remain quiet. The furs and blankets covering them have grown still as the people resting beneath them sink deeper into sleep. Their breathing moves gently through the air, steady and untroubled, blending with the slow rhythm of the hearth. The longhouse has entered its calmest hours. Earlier in the evening, there were more movements, footsteps crossing the floor, wood added to the fire, quiet voices speaking while the meal was shared. But those moments belong to the earlier part of the night. Now the house rests. He lowers himself further onto the platform, letting the furs gather around his shoulders. The thick hide holds warmth easily, trapping the heat that drifts outward from the hearth. Beneath the fur, the wooden boards of the platform carry a faint trace of warmth that the fire has slowly passed through the room. The cold outside presses steadily against the walls. Though it cannot be seen from inside, the winter air continues its patient work beyond the timber and turf. Frost gathers along the outer surfaces of the roof beams, and the snow that rests above the longhouse grows harder as the temperature settles deeper into the night. Yet the walls hold firm. The turf packed along the sides of the building slows the movement of cold air, while the steady warmth of the hearth pushes outward from the center of the room. He adjusts the fur once more across his chest. The movement is small and quiet. When he settles again, the platform beneath him remains still, the wood solid and familiar after many winters spent in the same place. Nearby, the fire has grown quieter. The small branch he placed earlier now burns among the coals, its surface glowing faintly as the embers continue their slow work. Flames appear only occasionally along the edges of the wood before sinking again into the deeper red light beneath the ash. This is the way the hearth must remain through the longest part of the night. Too much flame would brighten the room and consume the fuel too quickly. Too little would allow the warmth to fade before morning. Instead, the embers breathe slowly. He watches them for a moment longer. Their glow spreads gently across the hearthstones, casting a dim light that reaches the lower beams of the roof and the nearby sleeping platforms. The shadows they create move almost imperceptibly as the coals shift beneath their thin layer of ash. Beyond the doorway, the village lies quiet beneath the winter sky. Though he cannot see it from where he rests, the long houses outside remain still beneath their coverings of snow. Smoke continues to drift from the vents above some roofs, thinning gradually as the night air carries it upward. The narrow paths between the homes lie undisturbed. Earlier footprints fade slowly as frost settles across the surface of the snow. In the enclosures near the edge of the settlement, the animals remain sheltered beneath their roofs of wood and straw. From time to time, one may stir in its bedding, but most of them rest deeply through the coldest hours of darkness. Inside the long house, the warmth of the hearth continues to gather. The air near the center of the room remains soft, while the outer edges carry a faint chill where the cold presses more closely against the walls. Between these two currents, the room holds its balance. He closes his eyes briefly, not fully asleep but resting in the quiet warmth that the fire provides. The sounds of the hearth grow softer. Each movement of wood or ash seems farther apart than the last. The fire has entered the slowest part of its burning, where the embers hold their strength quietly beneath the surface. The long house breathes gently around him, and outside the winter night continues its calm watch across the silent Viking village. The fire continues its slow, steady work. The embers rest deep within the hearth now, their red glow dimmer than before, but still strong enough to hold warmth in the center of the longhouse. Thin threads of heat rise quietly from the coals, drifting upward toward the dark beams that span the roof above. The room remains still. Only the faint shifting of ash disturbs the surface of the fire from time to time. When a small piece of wood settles deeper into the embers, a soft glow spreads briefly across the hearth stones before fading again into the steady pulse of red light. He lies quietly beneath the fur. The thick hide covers his shoulders and chest, its warmth gradually gathering around him as the heat from the hearth moves gently through the air of the room. The wooden platform beneath him has softened with the warmth that has slowly spread outward from the fire during the night. For a while he remains awake, listening. The long house holds many quiet sounds during the deepest hours of winter. None of them are loud, but together they form the slow rhythm of the house resting through the night. From somewhere along the outer wall, a faint creak passes through the timber. It is brief, almost uncertain, as the wood adjusts itself against the cold pressing from outside. The sound travels along the beams for a moment before disappearing into the stillness. The man does not move. Such sounds are common when the night grows colder. Outside, frost continues to gather across the surfaces of the settlement. The snow on the rooftops has hardened slightly since evening, its surface tightening as the temperature settles deeper into the valley. Beyond the longhouse walls, the village remains quiet beneath the dark sky. The cluster of homes rests low across the snow covered ground, their roofs still heavy with winter frost. From several of the smoke openings, thin trails continue to drift upward, though they are fainter now as the fires inside those houses settle further into embers. The paths between the homes lie undisturbed. The footprints left earlier in the evening have grown softer, their edges blurred by frost settling into the surface of the snow. By morning, many of those marks will have faded almost completely. Near the outer edge of the settlement, the animal shelters remain quiet. Within their wooden enclosures, the animals sleep among thick layers of straw that hold a trace of warmth against the cold ground. Occasionally, one may shift slightly in its bedding, sending a brief rustle through the shelter before becoming still again, but most of the village rests without movement. Inside the long house, the fire dims slightly as the wood continues to burn down. The small branch added earlier has now settled into the coals, its remaining shape barely visible beneath the layer of ash that covers the embers. The glow beneath that ash remains steady, releasing warmth slowly into the room. The air near the hearth stays comfortable while the outer edges of the long house carry a faint chill where the night presses closest against the walls. He adjusts the fur slightly along his shoulder without fully waking. The movement is small, almost instinctive, drawing the thick hide more securely around him as the warmth of the hearth continues to soften the room. The fire answers with a quiet shift of embers. A small line of flame appears briefly where the wood settles deeper into the coals, brightening the hearth for a moment before fading once again. Above, smoke drifts steadily through the roof opening. The warm air rising from the fire carries it upward in a slow current that slips quietly into the night sky beyond the longhouse roof. Outside, the stars remain clear above the valley. They shine steadily across the dark sky, unchanged by the quiet passage of the hours below them. Beneath their light, the Viking settlement rests peacefully within its ring of snow-covered hills. The cold continues to spread gently across the ground, but inside the longhouse the hearth holds its warmth. The embers glow softly, the timber beams remain still, and the quiet rhythm of the winter night settles deeper around the sleeping house. The embers in the hearth continue to glow with quiet patience. Their light no longer reaches far across the room as it once did earlier in the evening. Instead, it rests low within the stone circle, a deep red warmth beneath a thin veil of pale ash. From time to time, a small pulse of orange appears, where the coals shift gently against one another, then fades again into the steady breathing of the fire. The long house remains still around it. He lies beneath the fir where he settled earlier, the heavy hide drawn loosely across his shoulders. The warmth of the hearth reaches him in slow waves, gathering beneath the blanket and along the wooden platform beneath him. His breathing moves quietly in the dim air. It is slow now, deeper than before, the rhythm steady as the night settles further across the settlement. From time to time he shifts slightly beneath the fur, not waking, only adjusting the weight of the blanket where it rests along his shoulder or across his arm. The movement is small and brief. Soon the stillness returns. Across the longhouse, the other sleeping forms remain quiet along the platforms that line the walls. Their blankets lie unmoving except for the faint rise and fall that comes with breathing. The room holds a shared calm that belongs to the deepest hours of night. The fire continues its patient work at the center of the floor. A piece of wood settles softly into the embers, releasing a faint glow that brightens the hearthstones for a moment before dimming again. The sound it makes is little more than a whisper of shifting ash. Above, the smoke opening in the roof allows a slow ribbon of warmth to drift upward into the cold air outside. The longhouse timbers answer the cold in their own quiet way. Now and then a beam releases a faint creak where the wood tightens against the winter air pressing along the outer walls. The sound travels gently along the rafters before disappearing into the calm darkness of the room. The man beneath the fur does not stir. His breathing continues in the same steady rhythm, the warmth of the hearth slowly gathering around him beneath the layered hides. Outside the walls, the night continues across the settlement. Snow rests across the roofs of the long houses, its surface hardened slightly by the cold that has deepened since evening. The beams beneath it hold firm, carrying the quiet weight of winter without movement. Above several roofs, thin smoke continues to drift upward from the hearth vents. The trails are faint now, rising slowly into the dark air before dissolving among the stars. Within those homes, embers glow quietly just as they do here, holding warmth through the long hours before morning. The narrow paths between the buildings remain untouched. Where footsteps once crossed the snow earlier in the evening, frost has softened their edges. The marks grow shallower with each passing hour as the cold settles across the ground. Near the edge of the settlement, the animal shelters remain quiet beneath their roofs of timber and straw. Within the enclosure, one of the animals shifts slowly in its bedding, disturbing the straw for a brief moment before settling again. The faint rustle travels across the still air and fades among the silent buildings. Above the valley, the sky remains wide and dark. The stars shine clearly in the cold air, their light steady above the snow-covered slopes that surround the village. The frozen stream beyond the settlement lies silent beneath its thin cover of ice, winding unseen through the quiet valley floor. Within the long house, the fire dims slightly again. The embers remain strong, but the small tongues of flame that once rose along the wood have nearly disappeared. The hearth now glows mostly with the deeper red light of coals resting beneath ash. Its warmth still reaches the sleeping platforms. Beneath the fur, the man shifts once more, drawing the edge of the blanket a little closer along his shoulder before becoming still again. The movement is slow and half conscious, the kind that comes during the deeper stages of sleep. The fur settles around him. The fire continues its slow breathing. The longhouse grows quieter still. The beams overhead rest in darkness while the faint glow from the hearth touches the floor nearby. Smoke drifts gently through the roof opening, disappearing into the cold air above the house. Outside, the settlement remains calm beneath its covering of snow. The long houses stand quietly along their winding paths. Their hearth fires burn low behind timber walls, while the village rests within the shelter of the valley. And beyond those homes, the winter night stretches outward across the frozen land, continuing softly beneath the northern sky,